My name is Russell Storer. I'm the Curator of Contemporary Asian Art here at the Queensland Art Gallery, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Erin Gleeson, who's going to give the next paper. Erin is a curator and a writer, originally from Minneapolis in the US, who moved to Cambodia in 2002 on a Humphrey Fellowship awarded by the University of Minnesota Human Rights Center. Currently, Erin's curatorial work focuses on developing and presenting Cambodian contemporary art practices both within and outside of Cambodia. And Erin was certainly a very important point of contact for us when we did our research, travelled to Cambodia last year, and was very involved in all the artists that we've been working with. In 2008, Erin established Pasak, a studio residency program in Phnom Penh for emerging artists. Erin's also the Cambodian desk correspondent for Art Asia Pacific magazine. It's a great pleasure to bring Erin. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Today I'm going to speak about the development of Cambodian contemporary practices, and specifically about the 4 artists presented from at APT6 for the first time. For nearly 20 years, different APT teams have been investigating art and artists in the growing panorama of Asia and the Pacific. With distinct approaches and platforms, by now they've collectively chosen over 400 artists by this year's time. These artists share in common a particular significance in the region and or internationally, and they've been representative or symbolic of modernist and contemporary movements from the 1960s until today. This year, APT6 Incarnation continues this tradition and adds a new and even more inclusive platform. And this platform shows recent shifts in contemporary practices from countries that have never yet been represented in APT. And Cambodia is one of these countries. So what I'd like to do, first of all, is just to take a look at over the 20 years that APT has been expanding, to kind of look at what was happening in Cambodia for those 20 years while it was kind of in isolation. So the word art in the Khmer language is salapak, and it remains synonymous even today with communal dance, performance, and decorative practice founded on ancient agrarian, courtly, and religious livelihoods. Cambodia's capital, Phnom Penh, was one of the wealthiest and most culturally vibrant cities in the 50s and 60s. And it was at that time that the French colonial Beaux-Arts school expanded their Khmer traditional program, which was silk weaving, silversmithing, kite making, mask making, basically living traditions. They departmentalized into a Beaux-Arts curriculum. And then they expanded this in the 50s to include canvas, painting on canvas, versus that on temple walls. Yesterday on the artist panel and curator panel of the Mekong up in the gallery, Vietnamese artist Khan, who's making the ceramic pieces, mentioned that modernist practices in Vietnam ended just as quickly as they started in the 50s, and they were not revived until the 90s during the open door policy. And Cambodia's story is not so different. There's a parallel there, right, as neighbors. Although the foreign modernist painting techniques that were introduced in the 50s and 60s were gaining a bit of momentum, that those influences never became very significant before the interruption of war in the late 60s. Phnom Penh was emptied on the 17th of April in 1975, and for nearly 4 years, very radical ideology, the Khmer Rouge era, targeted those with requisite knowledge for the continuity of culture. And 90% of educated people, including artists, were murdered. Because the ideology enforced a very cultureless year zero, also most photographs, books, any kind of historical records or testimonials were also destroyed during that time. So post-Khmer Rouge art education programs were controlled by the ruling Vietnamese, who liberated but also invaded Cambodia. And so these practices at the art school were quite restricted and reinstated until the early 1990s. Although the Vietnamese government did send artists that survived to Soviet bloc countries to earn their masters in painting, masters in design or painting, when those artists returned to the country, they returned to a place that was in reconstruction. And in trying to reconstruct a culture that was threatened, I think very understandably so, they didn't reach to foreign concepts. They really wanted to reinstate what was truly Khmer. And so then they reverted back to the Beaux-Arts traditions implemented in the 50s and 60s. So this was the practice up until the mid-1990s still. So it wasn't until the turn of this century, which is now almost a decade ago, and more specifically in the last 5 years, that contemporary practices have shifted towards individualistic expression and experimentation with materials and new technologies. These shifts are largely due to relatively greater political stability in Cambodia, as well as a global economic shift, which has created greater exchange of resources and information within the region. Cambodia and neighboring Southeast Asian nations have a very layered and invariably interwoven history. So therefore, the Mekong is a very apt mapping platform to introduce audiences to what is happening in Cambodia. One of the largest rivers in the world, the Mekong is a main channel and symbol of exchange and change in the region. Presented for the first time alongside Myanmar, Thailand, and Vietnam, this map stirs curiosity about Cambodia's presence in a region rather than the absence of its past. The co-curators of the Mekong platform, Queensland Art Gallery's Russell Storer and artist and curator Rich Streit-Metatron, made a very thorough and sincere investigation in Cambodia through a couple of trips, a few trips, after which they selected 3 Cambodian artists, and the cinema department selected 1 Cambodian filmmaker. So totally there's four artists represented in this APT from Cambodia. These artists are Svai Kin, who's a painter, and he was born in rural Tak Keo in 1933. He passed away last year. Filmmaker Riti Pan, who was born in 1964 in Phnom Penh. Sculptor Sopi Pik, he's harvesting his bamboo. He's born in rural Battambang in 1971. And photographer Vandi Ratana, who's the youngest of the 4, born in 1980 in Phnom Penh. Each selected artist is senior, or was senior. They have a gap, a very large gap in age, but even the youngest is senior in his practice. So they're senior and prolific in their respective medium. Their wide age range might infer that there is a generational gap. But in fact, the artist's intentions and their practices are very, very connected. They're all deeply affected by war's legacy of absence, and the artists express a sense of obligation to preserving and continuing a national identity. Survivors are often incredibly adaptable and creative people with little means, and this is exemplified by generations of Cambodians that survive on very little. And most recently, this is apparent also in the practices of these contemporary artists, as well as many others that I don't really have time to share with you today. But examples of this kind of resourcefulness with these 4 artists include Sophia Pik's choice of material. He's using bamboo and rattan, which are the most ubiquitous materials for farming, and 75% of Cambodia's population are farmers. It's also the very cheapest materials you can find. Riti Pan is resourceful in the sense that the war didn't leave many trained people to make film, and many of the films were destroyed. Out of 400 films that were made in the 50s and 60s, only 33 remain today. So he's had to train film crews, and he often is using actors who are not actors. And he stays with them for sometimes his crew and his trained actors, sometimes for months before they start to film. so that even though it's not a trained acting, it's a very natural feeling between each other before they begin filming. Ratana, in the absence of a contemporary art school or a photography program in the country, or any type of art history program, he's self-taught, as is the case with Sveiken, who started his career out of necessity. When he retired, he needed a way to support his family, and so he began painting. So the artists all shape their practices differently, and outside of the traditional trajectory of art education, traditional art education at the Royal University of Fine Arts, they have no contact with this formal education that continues today. That's the Beaux-Arts, like technique-based education. So this reveals their positioning in the development of contemporary practice, and a new community, and a new history, in a way, a new articulation of a history, one which they've greatly impacted and really shaped this last decade. So as I share briefly about each artist, you'll notice a concurrent narration of historic events. And rather than reflecting on the ethnocentric history that's been written by foreigners, very popularized by foreigners, these artists and others in Cambodia are revealing a personal or insider's view into their history, which is really rarely heard. They do not make generalizations, they don't speak cynically, they don't speak ironically, they don't really speak politically or philosophically even. They have a very practical approach, and their work derives and reflects their life, their experiences. And he was invited by the director of Darwood and the late Ingrid Mann to illustrate a story he had written after his wife passed away. So in a matter of 4 months, he created 128 cycle painting, documenting, it was supposed to be his wife's life, but in fact it was really his life. For example, there wasn't the birth of their children, but it was, for example, his first exhibition was in her life. But basically this archive, now it's scattered around the world in private collections, but 128 canvases in the absence of kind of any photographs actually served as a really important archive. Through the 20th century, from 1933 he was born, and he lived to survive so much, which the coming paintings will tell you about. Just want to note that Raham's early approach to exhibitions, they were really the first to have something that they wanted to be a contemporary space, but not too contemporary, because they really respected the traditions that were happening across the street at the Fine Arts School. And so they had a platform, kind of an unwritten platform of tradition and continuity. And I think this example has really been a model, whether artists know it or not, that tradition and continuity can, tradition can continue, and it doesn't mean there's a conflict or a tension there. And I think this was in part because of the example that Raham set about 10 years ago. Okay, so after Sveiken's first solo show, he became commonly regarded as the most senior figure in Cambodian, in the practice, in the development of Cambodian art. And this was mainly because he was the first to really candidly depict life, instead of, other painters were painting Angkor Wat or a very idealized, countryside vista, or a hill tribe scene, or the building of Angkor Wat is that it was very glorious. In fact, it was slave labor. As one writer once put it, he painted the stuff of life. His life, which were sometimes significant moments in Cambodia's history, and other times very ubiquitous daily activities that you would see on the street. He believed that it was important to make a record of life for the younger generations, so that they would remember how things were in his life. Sveiken was born in 1933, as I mentioned, and that's 70 years into what was not even Cambodia, French colonial Indochina. So he lived to see his country re-become a country. He followed tradition by entering the monkhood and studying the Buddhist precepts before he married and had 5 children. His first career and his longest career was as a handyman at a porter at Raffles Hotel Royal. And this is some documentation of a memory of cleaning the floor, weekly cleaning at the Royal. When he was in 1993, he began painting. He was asked to retire by the hotel, And he cleverly practiced painting things for hotel guests. For example, the Italian man's motorbike, and then he would solicit the sale to that Italian man. Or the French woman's bungalow, and then he would solicit the sale of painting to the French woman. So, with great tenacity, he needed to find something to sustain his family, and so he chose painting. His uncles were temple painters, but he never did paint as a young person. But he was familiar with the living practice of painting, having painting around. So this began to earn him more than his monthly wages ever had. $2 a painting, $5 a painting, $7 a painting. And so he became very confident that he could continue to support his family, but how to do so when he wasn't in the hotel. So he set up a studio on the corner of the street and just began painting everything that he could see around him. In this way, he became a really strong model for the younger generation as a really hard worker. So he dedicated, as he went to work every day at a certain time and stopped at a certain time for his career at Raffles, he also painted in this way in public. The wonderful painting of his when he became a server, and so that was after the war. He was serving at banquets. You can see very closely the apsaras, the angels on the side of the door, flanking the door, and kind of every few people. It's mixed between a UN staff and Cambodian politicians at that dinner table, which he remembered very clearly. Most common throughout his 15-year painting career were scenes from his times, some common times and some really extraordinary times that were also very common in his life. The people on 18th of April in 1975 show city dwellers leaving together. The Khmer soldiers divided people into groups, and the monks were kept together, as you can see on the left side of the painting. There's one body dead in the foreground, but otherwise we don't see any trace of violence. The homes, I think this painting is very interesting. The homes are already very skeletal, and I don't know how much he thought about that, but from that day, until 4 years later, the homes were really skeletal. The next painting, Vietnamese planes and Pol Pot soldiers in battle, shows the battle with the villagers very small in the foreground, walking with very few belongings from village to village during the Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia, which is also known as the liberation of Cambodia, depending on who you ask. This painting could very easily be seen as a very nice meeting in the countryside, in the shade, and it almost resembles courtly paintings of former kings and their worshippers. But the title we see is Monthly Mandatory Meeting, 1975 to 1979, where all people were required to go through a brainwashing session. In the case of still lives, Sveiken made many still lives, and especially between the periods of 2005 and 2006. He remained disinterested in mining international art history. He was very unaware of what anybody had painted in the past, and he didn't really care. I brought many journalists and curators to his studio, and it was always so humorous when they really wanted to know the deeper meaning behind this bicycle, or the deeper meaning behind the bathtub. And he always responded so consistently with a very matter-of-fact intention. And it's interesting because there was very lack of diversity in the markets up until about a few years ago. A lot of his still lives are in ways like a catalog of objects of how most Cambodians, what objects Cambodians lived with. And so actually they were very popular with collectors in Cambodia, and I think when people bought the object, they also felt like they were collecting an item, that would one day disappear. And he was interested in painting things that were disappearing, such as there's very rarely seen a tandem bike or an object. It's a rice mill, a very old rice mill that some people use in the countryside still, but in the city, not anymore. I'd like to play a 1-minute clip of Sveiken introducing his body of work he made for APT. So he's going to tell you about what it's about and what his intentions were. The documentary was made 1 month before he passed away, and incredibly, he was in the greatest of spirits and the greatest of health this day, weeks before he had been in bed. And I warned the film crew that it might be a difficult day, but he was so happy, and I think for that very reason, because he was able to share his knowledge. And actually this series is called Sharing Knowledge. So the documentary continues for about 20 minutes, and he describes the series of paintings. The original cycle, he wanted to be 32, and he lived to paint 12. And it's wonderful that the Queensland Art Gallery has collected the 6 that are in this show, which made him so happy before he passed away. So just I'll run through 3 of these pieces. This one is called, the title, One Who is Rich but Neither Feeds Nor Looks After One's Parents is Subject to Ruin. And it shows a man being found near abundant food, more food for his dogs than his small parents, who are cornered on the right-hand side. This, which I very deliberately made the poster that went all over Phnom Penh City advertising this exhibition, because it says, one who is proud of his social status, who does not care for his relatives and friends, and even looks down on them, is subject to ruin. And this was really particularly important for him, particularly important painting for him, because he was critical of the current and rising abuse of power by politicians who, in most cases, are not trained or educated to do their job. And right now, Cambodia, everybody has come from the countryside. Everybody has come from a farming family, except this very new generation. And he sees that people are forgetting the humility of the Buddhist scriptures that everybody grew up with, and the agrarian livelihoods and dedication that you need to show for hard work that everybody grew up with. This very funny canvas, which he laughed very hard about, which you'll see in the film if you see it as an educational resource center. Yes. It says, eating the meat and chewing the bone is subject to destruction. And is a common phrase used in Cambodia, actually. In this case, he means meat is relatives and the bone is money and power. So these phrases actually not so old school. I mean, they're very old, but you hear them commonly in the home. And people have respect for these phrases, and even if you have young teenagers who are becoming very modernized, and it's not necessarily Western modernized. A lot of this modernization is maybe a second-hand Western modernization. It's coming from Korea or Thailand, or influences from soap operas in Hong Kong. Even when they have these influences, it doesn't mean these lessons have left their life necessarily, which I think is really special about this work as well. The next artist I'll speak about is Riti Pan. Today, when nearly most efforts to understand and progress the Cambodian story remain anchored in past trauma, the work of award-winning filmmaker Riti Pan is formative. Pan's work, he works in the documentary and docudrama genres and has made 15 feature works in 20 years. He's now a French citizen and divides his time between Paris and Phnom Penh. And when he's in Phnom Penh, he's basically living at a resource center that he established with a colleague, a Cambodian filmmaker, Ian Panakar, in 2006. And Bopana Audiovisual Resource Center is a really extraordinary digital archive, an exhibition space, a small cinema, and a really great training program to build up the capacity in the film industry. Ritipan was born in 1964. He suffered as a child under the Khmer Rouge, and most of his family died, including his father, who had dedicated his life to improving the education system, so he was one of the first people to die. Pan was a refugee to Paris, where he studied film at the prestigious IDH-EC, or the Institute of Cinematography. And he returned back to Cambodia not even 10 years before he left. So basically right after he obtained his education, he went directly back to make a documentary called Site 2, which is the site he left from in 1989. One of Pan's earliest films, The Rice People, is based on a 1966 Malaysian novel called Rice, and it focuses on the sacredness of land. And I begin with this one because it differs greatly from all of his other films, but I do want to show that there's culture in Cambodia is really the root is agriculture, is where a lot of culture comes from. And this film is usually considered his most beautiful. When he's making documentaries, he says he's not as concerned with aesthetics, or he doesn't want aesthetics to disrupt the movement of people's voices rather than the beautiful framing of a scene. And so in this, it is really beautiful. And he said it's not a gratuitous aesthetic, and he referred to the people's labor into making this film beautiful, making the rice field beautiful. So here it would be a great film for like 5th grade, because you learn how to grow rice. I mean, if you really want to inform people about what is life in the rice field, I learned so much. And I just pulled a few different stills all through the film as a really intimate view of how rice is harvested and how much it means in all of these different stages. There's a different word for rice in every different stage as it moves along. In the film, Vong Po and his wife Yim Om and their 7 daughters, and he often uses women are the centerpiece of most of his films, they face consecutive hardships with their health and precarious dependency on nature. The mother's mental instability worsens, and after the death of her husband, the female household assumes all the roles of the traditional females. Rice People is unlike his other films because it focuses on the life cycle rather than the repercussions of war, more the repercussions on dependency of nature and the dedication of people in the fields. Nature being gods and gods being nature, one and the same. As viewers, we're brought into the rice paddy and we learn the ancient agricultural intelligence. Even today, the fields look like this. So although it may seem like a period piece in a way, this is really how people are living. Even this was made in 1994 and things have not really changed much. Most of Pan's work seeks to humanize people who are put in very dehumanizing situations, from prisoners to perpetrators, his other work, prisoners to perpetrators, prostitutes to performance artists even. And overall, it could perhaps be said that he believes that all Cambodians have been dehumanized in some way through a century and a half of colonialism and decades of war, and also the certain methods of aid-based reconstruction that he clearly doesn't agree with, which is what many of his films show. This is from The Rice People. Especially this film is his criticism of the aid-based community. Paper Cannot Wrap Up Embers tells the story of 7 women, again women, living in a building which is at different parts of the building is a brothel, and these women, instead of showing them with their clients, or many photographers come through Cambodia and want to make a difference by taking portraits of these women outside of the place where they work, and he just has a very different approach to showing from the inside the lives of ordinary Cambodians, even though they're in a really extraordinary situation. And so in all of his films you see people cooking and eating together. And especially eating, the word to eat is actually to eat rice. You don't differentiate that in the language. as well as the care and maintenance for the self and others when there is very little. The attention paid to these daily rituals speaks to all people, and it also evokes reflections by other survivors like Primo Levi, who was very influential to Ritipan, who once wrote about the power of such gestures to maintain human dignity while being treated inhumanely. So Pan deliberately is confronting his audience with an almost uncomfortable intimacy between the camera and his characters, between the characters and the acknowledgement of their own circumstance, and then between the characters acknowledging that circumstance and the audience. And different examples of this in the papers Cannot Wrap Up Embers. Up on the left, you have these women taking care of themselves. They spend so much time doing their nails. So they're either sometimes doing drugs or doing their nails, caring for their children, getting ready to go and meet a client. And never have we been brought into the world of these women. And so we hear the stories from before they became a prostitute, and we learn how they became prostitutes. Or prisoners, they're kind of stuck in a brothel, they were bought, they were sold. So she says many boys were willing to marry me back home, and we know that that's not a possibility for her anymore. On the right hand, there's many scenes where they talk about, of course, what would they talk about? Their client the night before. And so in this case, she was raped by 20 women, and there was one young boy who helped her run through the rice fields. On the bottom left side, she was beaten the night before, and she just really believes that with money, she says, you can have a ghost crying flower. These women really want money because they see that that's their ticket outside of the brothel. And in the last, it says, the tongue wiggles, you live or you die. And through this film, you also get a sense of how Cambodians communicate with metaphors. It's a really strong base of the language to not speak so directly, but to speak in a metaphor. And so the tongue is the rich person. It has no strong bone. It can move wherever it wants to move. And you can commonly hear this phrase as well. Pan believes that to film someone is to be with someone. So the presence of his camera does not negate the experience between human beings. On the contrary, he says, with film there's a distance. So we need to make sure that we show that they're human beings and that they can breathe and what happens in their eyes. So you often see the cameras very close and for almost too long amount of time. And it was interesting, Tim Page was speaking earlier today about how you remember a photograph, but maybe you don't remember a moving image. And in this case, I feel like Ritipan's work is both photograph and moving image, because he stays so long on different scenes, and you really absorb that scene. The most confrontational of his work is his 2003 documentary called S21, The Khmer Rouge Killing Machine. Tuol Sleng Prison was coded S21 during the Khmer Rouge, and it was one of the main detention centers in Cambodia. It's a former high school and is situated in the heart of Phnom Penh, and an estimated 17,000 prisoners were tortured, interrogated, and murdered. Only 7 detainees survived, along with thousands of identity photographs, piles of obsessive pen-written confessions to crimes that no one committed. Of these survivors was painter Vanuatu, who produced portraits of Pol Pot and other leaders while in prison, and this is why he was able to survive, because his brushstrokes were gentle, and he produced portraits in his likeness, Pol Pot's likeness. So Pan formed an all-Cambodian crew. Often he works with a French crew, but he felt that in this case, or mixed crew, but in this case he felt like it was very important to only have Cambodians working on this film, and Cambodians who had survived and had memories of the genocide. So after 3 years of research and trust-building meetings with the different guards and interrogators and murderers at the prison, he reunited 2 survivors, 2 of the 7 of 17,000 survivors, with their prison guards and those that tortured and murdered the people around them. Currently, if you're following the news, the director of S21 is on trial right now. Duk He's on trial in Cambodia, and this trial is backed by the United Nations in cooperation with the Cambodian government and many international funders. You can say it's a Western trial, which is often called an international trial, in terms of a method of a path to justice. Pan is supportive of the trial, but very critical of the approach. And I think you can see this because he makes basically a very intimate trial in this film. So Vanuatu is there with his painting. In this case, it's a painting of hundreds of prisoners who died in massive cells. And he's standing with those who were responsible for killing those people, explaining to them how he felt when he had to eat bugs, when somebody died next to him, and what his experience was like. And then he asks them how they felt. And so you have this more like a truth and reconciliation trial in a way, having people come together and try to understand each other, and it's terribly uncomfortable. I want to show just a 1-minute clip, and this clip introduces one of the main characters who was one of the main guards and one of the main murderers. He doesn't know how many people that he murdered. And I just want to point out that like Ritipan's other films, he is introducing someone that many people would just call a murderer as who he is today and as who he was before he became a murderer, which is a farmer, an educated farmer. He was 12 years old when he was recruited, and he started murdering people when he was 15 years old. And so Ritipan has an incredible, I don't know how, an empathy, And so he sets the scene. This is the very beginning of the film, where Hui is with his parents in the countryside, also his wife and his babies.
Nhóm được khơi cha na để cây hai bụi nhóm công cây hai câu nhóm cua na tại khơi cha na lật cây nhãn ngót na lật câu nhóm cua na câu nhóm lật cây này là hồ khơi đã chặt na tung na sao sao phải vô tận bạn toàn câu nhóm cây khơi việc nhẹ lên vành được cháu đấy chúng ta lại nằm lắm nhóm này non câu lo tầm tới là câu chết nhóm chết này non mấy chứ mà nhóm được khơi nhà bốn làm được còn như đáy há đó
mai vậy nó ra ăn sải bài hai đúng rồi miền bia miền cam mỗi miếng ban nãy vậy thay nhau mấy cái
nó bờ dương sầm lạp phí được nhông to của nhông sầm lạp phí đầu chất nhông nó miền bạc hay đòi kỳ bình chia kỳ cầm tiền bằng hai đòi vào ngay cho vô trong này bao ký anh bên mình miền bạc bạn này lừa mi thông thông đại về mình chia thì chất cầm đất bậc nhông ngàyนี้nhông khai ba mỗi thứ có khai làm đấy cả nụ xong mãi nếu khai chứ nào bạn những nhóm thư đặc o là không tăng.
I recently asked Ritipan how he can capture such an exacting representation of daily life as I experience it, and the very subtleties of foreign influence, or the care or the destruction of the self, or the palpable repercussions in almost every aspect of society today. And he simply replied, they're documentaries. He's very observant. The next artist is Supipik, and there he is harvesting his primary material, which is bamboo. Pik was born in 1971 in rural Battambang. Similar to Pan, Ritipan, Pik is a survivor of war as a child. Then he became a refugee who also spent time on the Thai border many years before he was sent to another country. In this case, he settled in the United States. where he spent almost 20 years before returning, whereas Ritipan spent 10 years. He was educated in also great schools, the School of the Institute of Chicago, School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where he has his master's in painting, and he had a BA also in art from Amherst. So he had dedicated, he was very clear that he was going to practice as an artist, although his father wanted him to go to medical school. He wanted to practice back in Cambodia. He felt very called to go back, and he arrived in 2002. And when he describes it, it's very emotional and really complex. He began working very reclusively for about a year before many people knew that he was around or that there was some newcomer painting. And he had a few shows of his paintings of vessels in the first couple of years. But after those years, he found that this practice was not very relevant to the people, and he really wanted to connect to Cambodian people. In his words, it wasn't purposeful enough for the environment. It didn't communicate to the environment. So when he came upon this new material of communication in 2004, a new form, he became a sculptor, and he was using bamboo and rattan. He first made this piece. Oops. Oh, I just wanted to show the incredible transformation of the material. We're not harvesting bamboo, and within 1 week I took students to his studio, and they had already a small team of people working by hand all the time. He works together with them, and it's just fascinating how this material becomes what you see on the other side. But this was his first sculpture, and it's a set of lungs. It's called Silence. Originally it was covered with cigarette packages, and he was very unhappy with that result, so he ripped off the cigarette packages, and he really felt like something breathing. And I can say it wasn't just Sopiap who was really pleased with his first sculpture. It was really the whole community could kind of feel these lungs breathing on the wall too. And because he felt that communication with the people, then he felt happy, and he's continued this way ever since. Interestingly enough, this is very small, and this piece was his second piece. It's over 4 meters long. And I remember visiting Sopiap many nights. He made this for quite a long time because he didn't really know what he was doing. He was really trying to figure out, what does this material do? How can I manipulate it? Where does it go? Do I control it? Does it control me? And so I remember visiting one night, and the driver on the side of the street, the motorcycle driver, Cambodian, came into there's an outdoor studio, and he came in and he talked about how it reminded him of fishing traps, and he started advising him on how he could build it stronger, even though he didn't know what it was for. But it made Sopiap so happy, that he had really finally been able to find a form or a medium to connect with people. He didn't also know really what this was as he made it. And we spoke about the night a stomach or a snake, and in fact it's the same word, bo, in Khmer. And it became cycle, which is really kind of an iconic work for him in his short career. So when he discussed this, as well as this form, which is called hive, he began to speak about organs. So cycle was the stomach and hive was the liver. And he didn't want to confine the references. He didn't want it to be something, and he definitely wasn't really speaking about his past. He was very dedicated to being a formalist and concerned with craft and beauty. So this was maybe the stomach. It could be a stomach or a fishing net or just a biomorphic form with no meaning, and he was fine with that. He progressed from this point, realizing that organs are a universal language in a way. We share them, and they carry our experiences of life. This is a big jump, but his work continued in this kind of biomorphic way until just this last year, and I think very much because of the influence of being asked by APT to create a work that was going to be seated in the context of the region and Greater Asia. And he began really thinking about more concerns, more issue-based thinking, very still true to form, but he was communicating something that was more, not more obvious, but definitely more directive. So this is from a recent show. It's on now in New York, and the form in the foreground is called Intestines, Junk, Nutrients. And Supiep's studio is on a lake, and that lake is being filled in with sand from the Mekong to build Korean-funded skyscraping city. So his studio will disappear very soon, and so he's fishing out pollution from the lake and kind of archiving it inside his sculptures until there's really no lake to pull materials from. And this is the work first just installed to photograph it in Cambodia before it was shipped here. And this work is called 1979. Over 1 year of dialogue with Mekong curators, Russell and Rich, particularly Russell, it became time that Supiep's past memories became the foundation of a body of work. So 1979 is about memories. He doesn't really go far away from the idea of form. You don't necessarily know what these forms are, but they're memories of his journey from the Khmer Rouge camps back to his original village, and then the journey from the village to the refugee camp. So you see a bomb core and binoculars, mines, canteen, and you also see these small sculptures of cows. And this kind of perspective, maybe we can imagine what it's like to be a small child who is 8 years old, walking for about a week, seeing these strange, mysterious forms. And I think it's a really new idea for him to bring in different materials and different defined forms, such as animals. But I feel like it does give that sense of wonder, the juxtaposition of size, and the cows, their perspective of these large forms, and kind of the curiosity I feel even the cow beneath the binoculars is feeling. Pig thinks it's good if sculptures make them aware that there are shapes in their environment, because he says it encourages them to use their memory. And this memory is from being in a blood-stained Wat, and that's a Buddha that you can see in this on the right-hand side. And he left it open, and there are small tips of blood on the ends of the rattan. The last artist is, and the youngest artist is Vendi Ratana, and Ratana is dedicatedly working in the documentary genre, mainly with photography, different forms of photography, and also recently video. Ratana is known for his quiet and powerful humanitarian photographic work that documents Cambodian life from the private domestic sphere to landscapes that document changes in the public sphere to ordinary citizens at work or people in the midst of crisis. He's all over trying to capture life to make up for the lack of record that his parents' generation doesn't have. So Ratana comes close to his subjects, and usually his work is very intimate. He's a very intimate, he's a very warm person. He follows the trajectory of fire in the series in APT, and I'll come back to that to conclude about him. Just didn't have another photograph of him shooting, and so I just, this is his recent project I'll just mention, where he's documenting the stories from the survivors of the American bombing. And this is definitely not something that's often spoken about, and there has never been a public apology or a visit by, for example, Clinton visited Vietnam to discuss their war in Vietnam, but there has not been a discussion about the repercussions of that war for Cambodia or for Laos. Over the course from 1968 to 1973, America dropped 2,756,921 bombs on Cambodia. At that time, Cambodia was a neutral country, legally neutral country. So just to put this into perspective, just over 2 million tons of bombs, about 1 million less, were dropped in all of World War II. And if you know the destruction of Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Hiroshima 15,000 tons and Nagasaki is 20,000 tons. So we can know from the awareness raising he's doing in this project that Cambodia is perhaps the most heavily bombed country in the world next to Laos. So what he's doing is documenting these water masses, and in the countryside people call them Biha Bay, and it's the B-52 lake. So they're all over Cambodia, not just on the border of Vietnam, which Ratana traveled with a young team of a young film crew documenting these ponds, but also the people who have very vivid memories of those moments when those bombs were dropped. So there's an example of one of those, usually very perfect circle, pond, and of a villager explaining her experience of when they dropped in her village. This is his first body of work, and I mentioned that he's very intimate. He's documenting his parents and his friends' parents, and just very intimate scenes of people's lives. This is his mother. He also goes out on the street and documents what he thinks are important events for Cambodia. This is the first skyscraper. It opened for business about 1 month ago. And this is a work that you can see upstairs. It's called Fire of the Year Series 2008. And he uses 2008 because it's so common and people can, fire is an everyday occurrence. It's not very special. And in this case, he's documenting a village called Daktla, which means clear water village. And it's quite ironic because this village you wouldn't know is built on water because it's blanketed with plastic. And when it burned, it was absolutely destroyed. This is, for a few reasons. There's lack of firefighting resources. There's lack of access to homes because of the way that they're built on top of each other. But mostly because of corruption. If you want your house saved, you need to pay the firefighters because they're making about $30 a month. So I think Ratana's work reflects a very physical and emotional, sometimes a mental landscape of contemporary, everyday scenes, still really difficult in today's Cambodia. And in this way, he's creating a nascent archive of a nation searching to define itself in the region and beyond the region. The story behind this image is the young boy and hundreds of other young scavengers around the city have this network when there is a fire, and they all come and wait for all of the debris to cool down, and then they swimming through this really polluted waters to collect all of the scraps. And in this case, it took about 3 hours once it cooled for that to be entirely vacant of the scraps so that they can have some money from the recycling. And now there's a new village built almost immediately right after the fire. They have nowhere else to go, so they began to rebuild. So in conclusion, the range of artists' age, their personal histories, and their rigorous dedication to their chosen media, I believe it offers audiences a very inside perspective on Cambodia, on its history, its traditions, and its current transitions. These artists are providing a very long-awaited and thoughtful voice from Cambodia, and one that's serving to sustain and progress their cultural narrative and make a place for them in the region and larger Asia. Thank you.